all I have is 45 slides to do in 15 minutes. This should be pretty easy, right? So the uncanny valley of hybrid working. We have been talking about hybrid for a while now. COVID is definitely something that has brought it to the forefront. I know I spent a lot of time over the summer and a variety of clients talking about whether or not we should open up the offices and what that means. But as far as I can see, the industry is talking about it from two very different perspectives. We have the organizations themselves deciding whether or not they're going to allow people to work remotely and work in the office. And we have employees trying to make a decision as to whether or not they like either of those two options. We did some internal checking, and Thoughtworks is pretty split. We definitely have a lot of people who prefer working remotely, myself being one of them, but we also have a strong contingent of people who genuinely prefer being on site for a variety of reasons. So where does that leave us? How do we make decisions? Thoughtworks is probably a little different in that we very rarely think about individuals, and we very rarely think about the org in general. Our unit for thinking and for assessing whether or not something is a good idea or not is based off of the team itself. That's the unit by which we assume that progress is going to be made. And not all teams are the same. So when you're thinking about an organization, we might see homogeneous teams, so sales, HR, where we have a collection of individual contributors who, whilst they may act as a single body, their individual actions are do not directly affect their teammates. So if a salesperson is having a bad quarter, not great for the team, but predominantly not great for that individual. Development teams tend to be different, at least within Thoughtworks. We tend to think about our teams as being heterogeneous. We have a collection of people who all have specific roles, predominantly generalists, but we definitely see some differences in their project managers, tech leads, QAs, DevOps nowadays, although we prefer to think of those as just regular developers. All bringing different things to the party. And if we don't practice and work together, the whole team fails. One individual acting poorly can have dramatic effects on the stability of the entire process. So with that in mind, we're going to take a team view of what the various different types of working are. We're going to start with Colocation, which is really our comfort space. For the last 20 or so years, we've spent a lot of time and our clients' money sending people around the globe so that we can co-locate. And in an ideal world, it looks something like this. For a small team, we're looking at one table with developers on it, organized into pairs with visual, being able to see the stakeholders, having a whiteboard, being able to build our own radiators with free and easy access to a meeting space. Of course, this is a very idealized view, but it gives you some idea about when we say co-location, this is usually what we have in the back of our minds. And co-location scales really well. We can add more tables, we can increase the number of meeting rooms, we can have more radiators, we can use more room space. And that eventually grows out to something like peak co-location. At this point, when we're dealing with, say, 8 teams on the ground, 12 stakeholders, 4 meeting rooms, we're looking at essentially an entire floor in an office building. And that's about when co-location reaches its limits. I will explain why I'm not talking about multiple floors in a few slides' time. But co-location in and of itself is not perfect. Commuting absolutely is a factor. When we were doing exit interviews of thought workers early before COVID, one of the primary reasons people were leaving was because of the demands of travel. One of the fun things we saw throughout the crisis last year was that actually there wasn't a flu season. And so whilst COVID was terrible, most people and the number of 6 days was actually down. People weren't getting the flu, they weren't getting seasonal colds, and they weren't working their way through entire teams. We've also seen a reduction in corporate costs. So if you're able to close offices, if you're able to downsize your physical requirements, the corporate costs of co-location become very obvious. Offices aren't cheap. Their rents are extraordinary, particularly in high demand cities. Keeping that building the right temperature, having the support staff in place, all very expensive. And finally, we have the environmental impact. Absolutely, it's possible to have a geothermally and solar powered building with everybody walking in, but that is definitely the exception and not the norm within American working space. So let's take a look at the other end of the achievement system, what we've all been experiencing for the last 18 months, 2 years. In an idealized view of this, it's wonderful. Every developer gets to use their own machine. We use SSO to get into everything. We can set up our own radiators. A meeting is as simple as sending a chat invite and asking somebody if they'd like to talk to us. And that meeting only has to end when all of the parties have either reached a conclusion or the demands on their time have pushed them into a different direction. Very different from a co-located environment where meetings tend to end on the hour because somebody else has already asked for the room. Remote scales really well, as we're experiencing today. You can easily scale to having hundreds of people on a call at any given moment, which what you can do in a physical location, only if you have an auditorium. The idea of cramming hundreds of people into a single room, complicated and scary, especially in the middle of a pandemic. But remote, it works surprisingly well. Also, we have some other fun things. Mobbing used to be complicated, getting, say, 5 or 6 people around a screen, not as easy as getting a pair set up. For remote, it's just as easy as sending the link out to 5 people instead of 2. But without a doubt, remote is not performing as well as co-location, at least the idealized version of it. There are just some physical things to being in a physical environment that have just been very hard to replicate. Walk-bys were one of my favorite things to do as a tech lead when we were co-located. If I saw a pair that was struggling, or if they saw me and were asked for help, I could just drop in and talk to them. There was no need to look at my calendar. There was no need to plan ahead or schedule some time. All we had to do was sit next to each other and work through the problem. Similarly, you can be sitting at your desk, and because you're surrounded by people that are all working on the same problem, it becomes much easier to identify the problems. So if someone's talking about, I don't know, using JPA incorrectly or using Ruby at all, you can stop them before it gets out of control. There are some intangible benefits to being in the same space. Organic meetings, like bumping into the CTO of the company or meeting a stakeholder or user of the application, can be as simple as just being in the same room with them and finding out who they are. That's very, very difficult to replicate with a remote environment. And then finally, we have team building. Co-located, it can be as simple as saying, do you want to grab lunch or go grab a coffee? Shall we go and go for a meal? When you're remote, yes, we can have wine shipped to your house. We can agree to order food at the same time and then stare at each other over Zoom. And as magical as that experience is, it does not have the same results as quickly as if we were co-located. So how do we bridge this gap? And I think this is when the word hybrid starts to bounce in. How do we get the benefits of co-location and the benefits of remote? It would be, can we have this idea of like all of the best parts of both combined together to form the ultimate working environment? Well, first, let me introduce you to the concept of the uncanny valley. This is very common in special effects where at some point, the graphics get so good, they actually get worse. So a robot arm might do human-like tasks, but nobody is mistaking it for a human. But a zombie, a CG zombie, actually looks less human, almost the opposite of human, more like a corpse is less believably human than a robot acting like a human. And this isn't unique to just CGI. We see some of this in our regular working practices. So process improvement. If we want to increase productivity, we tend to increase autonomy. So we have waterfall somewhere in the middle, and say Zero's Agile, the thing that we're famous for, or Lean XP, pushing that a little bit more, where you get the more autonomy you get and the more productivity you get. But is that consistently true? Is this a linear scale? Well, we've kind of found out with the uprise of SAFe, we're seeing a reduction in productivity, even though we're seeing an increase in autonomy. I don't have any data to back that up, but I'm not entirely sure that's important. So what happens in this graph where we have, say, productivity versus, and again, this is very tongue-in-cheek, MBA happiness. If organizations really like the command and control structures that are much easier to implement with co-location. So what happens when we increase that happiness and get to productivity? We're already going to accept that remote is less productive than ideal co-location, but for the most part, we can accept that it's close, close enough that it doesn't really matter. So let's explore what really happens with this. What happens when we look at a real office environment, grade that against the metrics that we put together earlier, and get a sense of like, where does remote really fit into this? So working in an office, we looked at the idealized view. Let's look at the at this more realistic view. A co-located space, we have fixed seating, we have teams intermingled together. We can't necessarily guarantee that pairs can sit next to each other. We almost certainly can't guarantee that product managers and tech leads are close enough to get the overhearing aspects. There might be a wall between us and the subject matter experts. We're on the same floor, we're in the same building, but really we're just working in an office. It's not a co-located space, it's just an office. So much less benefit of walk by, much less capabilities with overhearing. Organic, probably about the same. Team building, about the same. What happens when they spread us out over the floor? We have, again, less walk by, less overhear, less organic, but about the same for team building. Split across buildings. Half the team is in building A, the other half is in building C. We've got stakeholders split across multiple buildings. Now we start to see the same problems that we're starting with remote. We're starting to see that walk-bys can only happen in a local environment. Overhearing is only local, organic is only local, but the team building kind of works. Same country, different time zones, same deal. And finally, we have working in different countries. Maybe even, which is normally the Thoughtworks case, we have people working in an open plan in the US, but working in an ideal situation when they are on a Thoughtworks site. And here we're really at local. If we can keep the Indian team working independently, they are essentially as good as a co-located team. But if we ask them to work as a single team, all of a sudden all bets are off. So if we map that out onto the graph, we see a decreasing amount of productivity, even though we're potentially increasing the amount of MBA happiness. So what is the difference between splitting a team across offices and being remote? Well, let's look at hybrid. Even with an idealized hybrid where we have idealized co-location, all of a sudden we lose nearly all of the benefits. We start to have this local only problem where, sure, we could do team building, but it's just the people who are local that are seeing that benefit. Same for organic, it's just the locals that start to see that those benefits. And so when we put it back into that table, we see that hybrid really, it's barely working better than having a team that's split across the globe. And of course, like if we were honest about co-location, let's be honest about remote. Not all remote is equal. So if we focus on, if we look at the typical case where we still have VPNs, we're going to we don't see as many of the benefits. We can't have our own radiators, we can't use our own machines, and we lose all the bandwidth advantages. So again, we started to create this hybrid valley. I'd just like to quickly leave you with these thoughts. If we are going to build remote, if one person is dialing in, everybody dials in. That starts to get around some of the problems. If you're going to synchronize people being co-located, synchronize it at the team level. Don't allow individuals to make decisions based on their own. Make sure that's for the benefit for the team and not for the individual. But otherwise, you lose all the advantages of co-location anyway. And finally, organize your organizations around the concept of being remote first. Make sure that if you do need to dial in, that experience is fluid and as efficient as possible. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.